Keep playing, Heather. I forgot the clicker. Thank you, Heather. Our children can be dismissed for their Sunday school classes if they would like. Some of you have asked. We had a great preaching teaching convention down at Ozark Christian College in Joplin this last week. Monday night I went to the President's Banquet, and it's I don't know, 200 or 300 people there. And I don't know most of them because they're mostly all Ozark graduates. I'm a Central graduate, God's College up there in Moberly. And I got there right as it started, and I sitting kind of way on the outside. And another guy came and sat around right next to me, and we just sat there for a little bit as the convention or the meal was starting. And then this guy reached over and grabbed my leg, and it was Jeff Blaine wearing a hat. I had no idea he'd followed me in. Our preaching theme is going back to the basics, studying the Old Testament A-list stories. And we're almost done. We have 2 sermons left, one today and one next Sunday. This means that next Sunday we have one big test. Next Sunday, March 1st, I'm asking all the Blue Ridge Christian Church to write out from memory our memory verse for this preaching theme, which is Romans chapter 15, verse 4. And it says this: "For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope." An excellent reason to study the Old Testament. Right there. Just that's not the only reason, but there's a good one there in Romans 15:4. Well, nearly everyone, including unbelievers and those that are hostile towards God and His people, virtually everybody, maybe at least in the United States, they know the Old Testament A-list stories. We got 2 left. Have I brought up any Old Testament stories that you were unfamiliar with? Have you heard of the Old Testament A-list story about Belshazzar's friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Have you heard about that one? Soon after Israel's civil war, they had their own north and south split, similar to the United States of America. 10 northern tribes, Israel, 2 southern tribes, Judah. This happened in 930 BC. Both nations began to ditch God, turn their back on God and Moses and the law of Moses that Moses had brought from God. And they started to, I want to say dabble, but it's worse than that. They started to really go wholeheartedly worshiping idols and the detestable things that sometimes come along with worshiping idols. For years, God sent the Old Testament prophets to Israel or Judah. He sent prophets to both nations, warning them, stop your idol worship, stop the way that you're treating widows, or I'm going to send a nation in to conquer you. And Israel, Judah, for the most part, they thought, we are God's people. There's no way God is going to allow us to be conquered. God had done this for years, almost 200, a little over 200 years, I should say. And in 722 BC, Assyria conquered Israel. The 10 northern tribes deported thousands back to Assyria. That left Judah, the 2 southern tribes left. We're just amazed after what they saw, how the Assyrians treated their brothers and sisters up to the north, that they would change, but they didn't. About 150 years later, in 586 BC, Babylon conquered Judah, the 2 southern tribes. That happened in 586, just a few years before they were going to be totally conquered. King Nebuchadnezzar had come down. He knocked on their door, so to speak, gave his calling card, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, took hundreds of healthy, intelligent young men from Judah and took them up to Babylon. He hasn't conquered the nation yet. This is Judah saying, hey, we'll give you this. We're not going to fight you on this. Just don't conquer us. And for years after this, they're paying tribute to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. But until then, he's got hundreds of their young men up in Babylon. And they are being trained. They're being, we would say, brainwashed to be good, not Israelites, not Jews, but to be good Chaldeans, to be good Babylonians. And they are brainwashed into thinking, Babylon is the greatest nation on earth, worship Babylon's gods. They were trained how to dress and how to behave, how to speak, and how to eat like good Chaldeans. They were given new names, Babylonian names, and thereby given new identity, new loyalties. That's part of the process of stripping them of their old identity and here giving them this new identity. 4 out of, we don't know how many hundreds of young men were taken to Babylon at this time. We only know the name of 4 of them. And perhaps it's because only these 4 Jews did the struggle, they did the fight to remain faithful to God, even though God has allowed this. They've been stripped of their homes, their families, and they're living up in Babylon. We're talking 12, 13, 14 years old. Perhaps only 4 of them were faithful to God. The first one is Belshazzar. That is his Babylonian name. But we know him as Daniel. His friends, he has 3 of them. We don't know them so much by their Hebrew or Jewish name, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know them by their Babylonian names. You and I would know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you have children, or if you were young enough, you don't know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You watch VeggieTales and you know them as Rakshak and Benny. All right. Would you please turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3? To introduce the sermon, many times in life there's always the one big one. And it applies to lots of things. There's always that one big one. We can remember that one big storm. We can remember that one accident. We can remember that one bad decision that we've made. There's always that one trait, that one big trait that we like or we don't like about our best friend. That one big trait that we like or dislike about our parents or our spouse. That one big trait that we like or dislike about our preacher. We can't forget about that one big event that we go through every year. Sometimes that one big event, we just can't wait for it to happen. And there are other big events that happen every year that we just can't wait to get through. Birthday. Sometimes young people just can't wait for their birthday. And when you get to be as young as me, birthdays are not that big of a deal anymore. Sometimes it's take an inventory at work. Or have to do that end of the year report. How some people just can't wait to get through it. Or holiday with the in-laws. You might really, really look forward to that. Or you just can't wait till you get through having the holiday with the in-laws. Sometimes it's those one big questions that we have to ask. Can I borrow some money? Can I get a raise? Have you ever had to ask a boss, can I get a raise? Will you marry me? That one big question. Well, In the sermon here this morning, we have something big here, the one big question for the sermon. And here it is. There's always one. There's always one big one. Here's the one big one for the sermon. Will we be faithful to God when we don't know the outcome? We have no idea. Would you be faithful to God knowing that your life is on the line? Your life could be taken from you if you remain faithful to the Lord. Would you remain faithful to God? That is the one big question. Before we're going to read some verses here, would you please pray with me? God and Father in heaven, thank you for your word. We thank you, God, for all the men and women in our past, our Christian forefathers and foremothers, that did everything they could to preserve your word and to see to it that we have a copy in our hands or on our laps, put in our own language. Thank you, God. It is my prayer that you would help us to study these verses this morning. Help us to fully understand what we're going to read. Father, I pray that you'd help us to interpret them correctly. I pray always, Father, that you help us to remember these verses. Let them encourage us for the rest of the time that you give us here on earth. God, thank you for your word. Would you please speak through it this morning? It is my prayer that would you please speak to us and teach us this morning to help us to grow closer to you. As always, God, there may be some ways in us, Father, that need to change, some thoughts and thought patterns in our mind that need to change. Would you please complete liberty to do that? Please be with us as we study these famous verses here. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Would you please read with me Daniel chapter 3. We're going to read the first 6 verses. Daniel 3, 1 through 6. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth was 9 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent together the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps and the prefects and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, all peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the horn, pipe, lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." Many believers stayed faithful to God, not knowing if God would help them or rescue them. We're going to start with this, similarities. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we go back to Daniel chapter 2. King Nebuchadnezzar had had a dream. God had given him a dream, and he didn't even begin to understand it. Nebuchadnezzar was wanting desperately to know what the interpretation of this dream. If you're a king, you'd want to know as well. He's desperate. He wants to know what this image was all about. And it is a statue of a man. His head, his chest, his waist, his legs, feet are made out of 4 different types of metal. The feet are made out of iron and clay that were mixed. The head was made out of gold, and we find out in Daniel that that head of gold represents the nation of Babylon. Kind of made Nebuchadnezzar proud. We wonder if this image that he had, this dream given him from God, has any influence over him making this golden statue. We don't know what it's an image of. 90 feet high, 9 foot wide. It could have been solid gold, probably was just overlaid with gold. It stands over 90 feet. Now, it doesn't mean just the idol itself is over 90 feet. We don't know how tall the pedestal was. And in an excavation recently, just 9 miles south of where ancient Babylon used to sit, they have dug and found a huge platform. It's 45 feet by 45 feet, and it stood 20 foot tall, and we're wondering if that is where this image stood, on top of this 45 foot by 45 foot platform. Don't know. Because of their faithfulness and blessings from God, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been promoted by King Nebuchadnezzar to leadership positions in his kingdom. Now, Daniel was made to serve Nebuchadnezzar inside Nebuchadnezzar's palace. We're guessing is probably a very close advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one who interpreted the dream that God gave Nebuchadnezzar. That might tell us why, well, where's Daniel during this time this image is inaugurated for the people of Babylon to worship? That might be the answer there. After Nebuchadnezzar's golden image was completed and erected, he called all of his government officials, the prefects, the governors, the satraps that worked all over. Babylon is now a huge nation. It is probably known as the most powerful nation on earth, if not the most, one of the most powerful nations. And here comes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as part of Nebuchadnezzar's leaders. They're all coming back to the city of Babylon for this dedication. Can you just imagine, as maybe you don't know the reason why the king is calling you back, and you're making your way and you're getting close to Nebuchadnezzar, or you're getting close to the city of Babylon, and way off in this, how far away can you see a 90-foot statue made of gold? Can you just imagine seeing that glistening, that gleaming there in the sun? You've seen it for a long ways, and maybe it's just wowed these people. And they're just, wow, Nebuchadnezzar, what have you done now? As they all gather, there comes a herald from the king announcing that whenever you hear the royal orchestra, or you hear the royal pet band. You remember pet bands? Whenever you hear the royal pet band, everybody is to fall down and worship this image, 90 feet tall. If you don't, you'll be thrown into it's always called a fiery furnace, a burning fiery furnace. The herald announces this. And at some point, the royal pet band starts to play music, and everybody in that area starts to fall down and worship Nebuchadnezzar's 90-foot tall golden statue. Except Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Verse 8 says that Chaldeans, probably some of their peers, who are also in leadership positions for King Nebuchadnezzar, they maliciously accuse Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego of not bowing down and worship the golden image. Now, why is it malicious to accuse them when it's very obvious they're the ones standing? Why is that malicious? Why is it a malicious attack? Why is it a malicious accusation? It's probably because of this. They don't care if the people of Babylon fall down and worship this image. They don't care. But they're going to snitch on them. They're going to tell on them because they do not like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There is probably some jealousy that goes on because here these Jews got promoted, and maybe they are above some of Chaldeans, some of these other Babylonians in the royal government. And they are racist. They just don't like Jews. I'm so glad we don't have that going on in our culture. And so they maliciously accuse them. They run as fast as they can to Nebuchadnezzar and reported this to the king. And the king becomes furious. And he's asked for these 3 Jews to come to him. After Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before his presence, we don't know how long. Was it hours? Was it a couple days? I don't know. But they're standing before King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar did not immediately throw them into the furnace. Why? It could be that whatever time it took to go round up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that the king's fury has calmed down a little bit. Maybe that's why. Maybe it's because Nebuchadnezzar, he liked Daniel. And perhaps he really likes his 3 friends as well. The wisdom that they have. And he gives them maybe the benefit of the doubt. He doesn't throw them immediately into the furnace. Maybe these are the reasons why. Maybe they didn't hear the herald. Maybe there's a language deal. I don't know. But he doesn't immediately throw them in the furnace. Instead, he kind of interrogates them, wants to find out some facts here. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, "Is this true that you do not serve the gods of Babylon, nor my gods, and you do not fall down and worship my idol? Is this true?" Verse 15 is very important to the story. Would you please read verse 15 with me? Here's the kind of the very end of what Nebuchadnezzar is saying to these 3 Jews. At the very end of the verses, what's very important to the story. In verse 15 says this: "Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, the harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" What God can rescue anybody out of Nebuchadnezzar's hands? He's already conquered many nations who had their own idols and their own gods, and they are no more. Nebuchadnezzar has already went down into Jerusalem, knocked on the door, and have taken hundreds of their best young men back to Babylon to make them into good Chaldeans. Is the God of Judah going to save you? Some see this as a Nebuchadnezzar mocking our God, mocking God of Judah by asking this question. I think very important to the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they'll answer him. They'll answer his question, what God can rescue you out of my hands? God will answer it without ever saying a word. Well, let's read Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. These are the only words that are recorded for us that they spoke in the whole book of Daniel. In fact, after Daniel 3, we don't read of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego anymore. This is about it. The only words that are recorded for us are their response to King Nebuchadnezzar. Let's read. We stopped at verse 15 there. Let's read verses 16 through 19. Here's their response to the king. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. All right. That's their response. Very bold, wouldn't you say? Very bold. Now, first, notice this. The first boldness from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is they called him, O Nebuchadnezzar. They did not call him, O King Nebuchadnezzar. That's very interesting. Is it just not recorded for us? They did call him king in verse 18, but not when they first addressed him. That's very interesting. Very bold. Then they say, we have no need to answer you for this matter. It's not they're saying, hey, we don't need to speak to you. That is not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saying. They're saying, King, we don't need to give you a defense. We don't need to answer the accusations against us. That's pretty bold. They confess that their allegiance is to God. Our God is the God that we serve. And that's the only God that we are going to serve. They boldly answered Nebuchadnezzar's questions with or without God, if he's going to deliver us or not. He is able to deliver us from your piddly, burning, fiery furnace. I added a few words there. I am claiming a creative license. And they said, God, will deliver us out of your hand. These 3 Jews, who are still quite young, are not intimidated by Nebuchadnezzar. I have a t-shirt that on the back of it, here's what it says. He who kneels before God can stand up to anyone. I think of that. I think of this t-shirt when I think of these 3 Jews answering the king this way. Not disrespectful, but they don't want to violate their for God up in heaven. What was said in verse 18 is also important to the story. They said, but if not. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they do not know for sure if God will deliver them. They don't know this. God can. And they even said God will. But even if he doesn't, they didn't know for sure if God was going to rescue them. If God is not going to prevent them from human French fry. These 3 Jews yielded completely to God's sovereignty. It is God's decision whether or not he's going to rescue us or not. And whatever God's decision is, we choose to be faithful to him. They remained faithful without knowing what God would do. What about you and me? Will we be faithful to God even though we will not know our fate, even if our own life is at risk here? Will we continue to be faithful to God? Does God rescue everybody? The question is, will we be faithful, whether God rescues or not? Their final words to the king in the book of Daniel, this is the last, this is it, of what they have to say that's recorded for us. Let it be known, we will not serve your gods or worship your golden image. Is that not bold or what? It's honest. Doesn't mean it's disrespectful. They're telling the truth. Very bold. There are some scholars that say here they were so filled with fear of God, they had no room to fear man. Isn't that awesome? Is that the same for you and me? Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were respectful to the king of Babylon. And at the same time, they're still respectful to the King of the universe, their God. All right. I told you that we're doing some similarities here. And before we get to this picture here, I'm going to take us back. All right? You guys can probably finish this. Anybody know what time it is? Tool time. Does anybody know what date it is today? What's today's date? February 22nd. February 23rd, AD 69, is Polycarp's birthday. He's known for have studied with the Apostle John. John is the only one of the apostles that lived to be an old man. Now the Romans tried to kill him, but he lived to be an old man. And as far as we know from history, he served as an elder in the church in Ephesus. Polycarp is a very godly man, and late in his life he became the bishop of the church in Smyrna, which is only 35 miles, mostly north, just a little bit west of Ephesus, which makes sense if he studied with and for those of you in our Bible study on Wednesday night, the Roman province of Asia, that's where Ephesus is here. And if you can see the two cities circled there, the bottom one is Ephesus, the top one there is Smyrna. This is where Polycarp is from. In 156 AD, Polycarp is 86 years old. The Romans in his area, perhaps it's even bigger, but we know that the Romans in the area of Ephesus and Smyrna are violently persecuting Christians. Romans had already put to death several church leaders that were in the same church as Polycarp. The Romans wanted the leader. They wanted to kill Polycarp. The church didn't want Polycarp to die because they thought about how demoralizing that would be for the church. And so they took Polycarp, 86 years old, and they were hiding him in a few farms outside of Smyrna. Roman soldiers were closing in. Church members wanted to move him to a different farm, knowing the Romans are getting closer and closer. But Polycarp would not allow it. He said, nope, that's enough. The Roman soldiers tortured a slave at one of the previous farms and got the answer out of him of where Polycarp is right now, and they go. They arrive at the farm that the Christians are hiding Polycarp in, and they come into Polycarp's presence. And Polycarp welcomed them and asked, "Can I feed you? Can you come on in and sit down at the kitchen table, let me feed you?" And they did. After the meal, Polycarp said, "May I pray for 1 hour before you take me to Smyrna?" And they were getting to like Polycarp, sweet old man. And they said, "Sure." He didn't pray for 1 hour, he prayed for 2. His captors tried to talk him out of it. They said, "Polycarp, just recant your faith and do your Hail Caesar stuff, and we don't have to take you in." Polycarp refused, and he went with them to Smyrna. Polycarp was eventually taken into the arena of Smyrna. The Romans have arenas in their cities. This is where they do gladiator games, and this is also where they do public executions. Polycarp was caught. The word got out, of course. He's taken into the arena, and everybody in the area was coming into the arena to see what's going to happen. They caught Polycarp. Standing room only. The Roman proconsul, who is overseeing the whole area of the province of Asia here, he's the one, he can free Polycarp, or he's the one who gives the order to put him to death. And he doesn't want to kill Polycarp. Several attempts. "Polycarp, just say that Caesar is king, and you won't have to die." Several attempts. And Polycarp would not. He would not recant. He would not say that Caesar is king. And so, this is his answer. It's recorded for us. 86 years I've served him, and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? The proconsul now is agitated, doesn't want to put him to death, threatens to feed Polycarp to wild beasts, but that didn't work. He threatened to burn Polycarp alive. Are starting to see some similarities between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Polycarp. No, not everything, but there are some similarities. There's one big, remember there's always one big. There's one big similarity between these two historical events. Neither Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had no idea if God would save them. And neither does Polycarp. That's a similarity. Here's another similarity. Of course, the threat of fire is a similarity. One more big one is both of these groups, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Polycarp, they chose to be committed to God even if it means a horrible death. That's a similarity. Neither of them would recant. Neither of them would change. All right. Let's talk about differences. Polycarp. Now, since the Christians, they do not worship the pantheon, the 10 Roman idols, they do not worship Caesar as a god, and they kind of, because of persecution, they worship kind of in secret. The Roman people calls the Christians atheists. Isn't that interesting? And as Polycarp is in this arena, he will not recant, and the proconsul has finally given the command, okay, that's Polycarp, you're going to be executed. The Romans in the stands of the arena shout, "Away with the atheists! Away with the atheists!" Polycarp motions with his hand towards the crowd that's sitting all around him, and he says, "Away with the atheists." Then they answer, "This is the teacher of Asia, the father of Christians, the destroyer of our gods, who teaches many not to sacrifice or to worship. And then the proconsul gave the order. Polycarp was tied to the stake. Isn't it awesome? They had cameras back there in 156 AD. Crazy, isn't it? He's tied to the stake. Wood was placed all around him and then set on fire. And Polycarp was burned alive in the presence of hundreds of people watching. Let's go back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where we pick up the story. King Nebuchadnezzar is filled with fury. He's so angry at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Told them that their God cannot deliver them out of his hand, even if they do not serve his gods, worship his golden image that he just erected. They're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. To match his hot anger, he orders the fiery furnace, the furnace to be heated up 7 times hotter to match his fury, perhaps. It would take a little time to do this. Well, let's talk about these fiery furnaces. They have excavated some fiery furnaces. Now, they were a lot of times built right on job sites. They're used to make bricks, or they're used to melt rock, you might say, to extract the iron out of the rocks. We call that smelting. They were built against embankments many times, or they have dirt put all around them. Here's one of them that they have found. Of course, we don't get to see maybe what the cover looked like, but you look at that and just judging, does it look like 4 men could walk around inside that? Don't know. Here's another one that has been excavated. That stick there is 10 foot. Was there room enough for 4 men to walk around in that? You see those holes in the floor. That's for the air to come up through, so they can heat. They can need a lot of oxygen to get something this hot, and so oxygen comes up and be able to cook the bricks or melt the rocks to get the iron out of the rock. They built up dirt all around to help keep the heat in. They lined their furnaces with brick, and then they put stone there on the furthest inside of that. They have one little opening where dirt isn't, where they can go in to set the bricks or get the rock out and in and out. And here we have, in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we have a door. Perhaps it's still right there at where the idol is. They had built the furnace right there. Makes it a lot easier to build this idol this big if you got the furnace right there. Heat generated between 1,650 degrees to 2,700 degrees. It would be impossible to make the furnace 7 times hotter than what they would normally use them for. It really would be impossible to double the heat. Why does Nebuchadnezzar say 7 times hotter? We're just thinking it's an expression meaning you get that furnace as hot as it can get, even if it's going to destroy the furnace. We don't need it anymore, perhaps. We already got the idol constructed. It's time to build up the heat, and King Nebuchadnezzar ordered some of his strongest, his best soldiers to bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because of the urgency of the king's command, they were bound wearing all of their clothes, still had their nice Chaldean hats on their heads. And once the furnace was hot enough, hot perhaps as they could make it, the soldiers carried them to the top of the embankment or the cliff, whatever that is built up against, came up on top of it. And they push Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace, and as they do, it says the furnace is overheated and it kills the soldiers who threw them in. Let's read Still in Daniel 3. Let's read verses 22 through 27. Because of the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed these men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like the son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over their bodies of those men. Their hair of their head was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed. No smell of fire had come upon them. Just like with Polycarp, there were all kinds of people witnessing this. The execution. The furnace was so hot, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the furnace, the soldiers pushing them in had died because of the heat. It appears the king is watching all of this from ground level, and he is sitting watching all of this. He saw something that made the king jump up. He jumps up to his feet. He could see through the door. There's 4 men inside the furnace and they're walking. They're not hurt. Would that cause you to jump off of your chair onto your feet? He recognized Shadrach and he recognized Meshach and Abednego, but the 4th one he does not recognize. He said is like the son of the gods. It's plural. The only thing that burned up were the ropes that had bound up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's so amazed Nebuchadnezzar himself came near the door. I bet you he walked very slowly. What do you think? If he saw his best, most powerful soldiers die because of the heat and maybe saw that as judgment from God, I bet you he's walking up to that door very, very hesitantly. And he walked close to the door and he shouts for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out, and he adds this: servants of the Most High God. They come out of the furnace, verse 26 says. The king wasn't the only one amazed. Some of the government leaders, perhaps even some of their accusers, came and inspected them. The fire, the heat did not harm their bodies or their skin. No hair on their heads was singed. Their clothes were unharmed. Interesting. It burns the ropes that were wrapped around them, but their clothes are unharmed. And here, I think, is the super awesome miracle. They do not smell like smoke. Boy, it doesn't take very long, does it, when we're around a campfire? Doesn't take very long for us to go inside and we can just smell that fire on us. They did not smell like fire. This is just Trent's opinion. There may be something more impressive than God's miracle here. Awesome miracle, no doubt, but something more impressive. The unwavering faith in God for these 3 Jews who've been ripped out of their families, their homeland, and their homes, brought to be educated as a Chaldean, and their unwavering faith in God. That is awesome. Our God is the God who can deliver out of Nebuchadnezzar's hands. God soundly answered Nebuchadnezzar's question in verse 15 without ever saying one word. Let's read what Nebuchadnezzar says after they obviously see a miracle has going on. Here's our last two verses for the morning. Here we go, verse 28. We stopped at verse 27. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." There's one big difference. You know it. We looked at similarities between Polycarp and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but there's one big difference. God saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but he did not save or rescue Polycarp. Here's some big differences. There's one big difference in all of these I'm going to say here. God chose to save the Israelites when they're trapped between the Red Sea and the Egyptians. But he did not rescue and save the Christians during the persecution started by Saul of Tarsus, right after the church began. God saved the Apostle Paul when he was tried to stone him to death. He did not save Stephen, who was stoned inside Jerusalem. God saved Hagar and her son Ishmael when they were lost out in the desert, dying of thirst. But he did not spare his apostles. James was killed by the sword. Paul was beheaded. Peter upside down. Thomas had spears run through him. Matthew was killed with a large axe. Simon and Thaddeus were beaten to death. But God saved the Apostle John when the Romans threw him in a vat of boiling tar. But God did not save his only son when he died on that cross. Those that are rescued are like a chef who's making a grand meal for some guests. And the chef will taste some of the food, but he's not eaten a full meal yet. He'll taste some of the food, but he'll serve the guests, and all of them eventually will eat the meal. All of them will eat the meal. But the chef got to taste. That's kind of like those who God chooses to save and rescue and those that don't. Even though he didn't choose to rescue them, they still got to eat the full meal. They still get eternal life. It's not about having enough faith. Now, there's one big difference. Here is maybe one big similarity. It's not about having faith or enough faith. It's not about how good we lived our life for God, whether he's going to rescue us or not. There's one big similarity to all these people we read in Scripture, whether they were rescued or not, or those that we read about in the Fox's Book of Martyrs. God did not rescue any of them. But there's one huge similarity. They all had faith in God even when threatened with their life. That is one big similarity, wouldn't you say? Sometimes saving the life of a believer or a Christian fulfills God's purpose. Is God just willy-nilly about who he rescues and who he doesn't? No. Sometimes rescuing the believer or rescuing the Christian fulfills his purpose of what's going on. And sometimes the death of the believer, the Christian, fulfills his purpose. And Polycarp The church wanted to save him because they thought it would demoralize the church if he was executed. It energized the church. Every February 23rd, for years, they celebrated Polycarp and those who had had the faith to keep their faith even in the midst of physical death. Polycarp's death is put in, it's way up high. His death, the way he died, such a godly man, it is recorded as one of the 100 most important, influential events in Christian history. Isn't that awesome? Not that God rescued him, but that he died. That is awesome. Only our God can do that. Would you please stand? If you believe in, have faith in Jesus, remain faithful until death. If we are faithful until death, there's one thing for sure. If we're faithful, even though our life would be taken from us, there's one thing for sure. There's one big thing for sure. You'll never regret it. I asked you one big question for the sermon. Will you be faithful to God when you don't know the outcome? That's the big question. Maybe that's the question yet to be answered. If it is time for you to begin to have faith in Jesus, during our decision song here, I invite you to come forward and let the world know about it. If you need to rededicate your life to God during this song, we're asking that you come forward and let the world know about it. Stay faithful until death. You will never regret it. Sing.
Great is thy faithfulness, O